Hi everyone, welcome to your first video on operant conditioning. Before you begin, press pause and type in the link for Training Penny as you see it on your handout. This will take you to a YouTube video and it should be the answer to your very first question. Before we get going on operant conditioning, just a quick review of classical conditioning. Researchers that you should remember from classical conditioning: John B. Watson with the baby Albert experiment and Ivan Pavlov with the salivating dog experiment. In both of those experiments, there was a reflexive behavior, a behavior that the subject did naturally, that became associated with something that shouldn't evoke the response. In the dog experiment, dogs salivate to food naturally. They don't salivate to bells. Pair a bell enough times with the presentation of food, and eventually the association is made and the dog salivates to the bell. When we talk about a learned behavior, it's a relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience with the environment. In that case, the relatively permanent change is the behavior to something that shouldn't cause it. Then we move into operant behavior or operant conditioning. This is going to be distinct because this is when we bring in rewards and punishments. Any behavior that increases in its frequency has been reinforced. Any behavior that decreases in its frequency has been punished. The increase or decrease is due to a consequence. It's really important to understand that if there's no consequence to a behavior, there's no need to really truly see an increase or a decrease. However, if a behavior is followed by a favorable consequence or the removal of something that the person doesn't like, the behavior may increase. However, if the behavior is followed by the addition of something negative or the removal of something positive, then we would call that a punishment. And I know that sounds complicated at this point, but it will clear itself up. Ultimately, consequences are what drive operant behaviors. As you read the definition for operant conditioning and then look at Thorndike's law of effect, you'll notice that the two are very similar. Thorndike's law of effect states that any behavior followed by a favorable consequence is more likely to happen or increase, and that behaviors that are followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely or decrease. That feels like a lot of common sense, but as we're going to see moving forward, there's a lot of science behind this. Operant conditioning is going to be based off of this principle. And again, we're talking about learning a relatively durable change in an organism's behavior due to experience in their environment. So a type of learning in which the behavior is strengthened if followed by a reinforcer and diminished if followed by a punishment. It's really important that no matter what comes before a reinforcement, whether it is positive or negative, you understand that the behavior becomes increased. It becomes more likely the behavior will continue. However, if the behavior is going to diminish, decrease, not become as frequent, regardless if the word before punishment is positive or negative, if the behavior goes down, the behavior is punished. At this point, please pause the video. Please type in the link that you have on your handout and watch the video on reinforcement theory. As you should now understand from watching the video, B.F. Skinner elaborated on Thorndike's law of effect and developed very specific behavioral technology like the Skinner box. This allowed him to measure behaviors. So it wasn't his opinion that these behaviors changed. He was able to show how immediate rewards affected the behaviors of pigeons and rats and all sorts of other animals. As you saw in the video, the conditioning chamber was something created by Skinner. It's sometimes referred to as a Skinner box. This box allowed absolute control by the researchers to determine when an animal would be reinforced and to record the number of responses that the animal gave. It also utilized what we call reinforcement contingencies. In other words, not any behavior would be reinforced, but the behavior was only reinforced if it was the specific behavior. In other words, reinforcement was contingent upon the behavior. If I wanted a pigeon to flap its wings, it would only get a food pellet if it flapped its wings. We can make these contingencies more extreme, and you'll learn more about that tomorrow. If we decided that we wanted the pigeon to flap 5 times or an unpredictable number of times, whatever it might be. But the rules that determined when the reinforcement would be presented to the animal. Here you see a Skinner box and a nice little rat gerbil thing inside it. And the way that this would work is that the animals again would be left slightly hungry. That way they would feel motivated to behave. And at first the mouse or rat would run around the cage, exploring the corners and crawling up the sides like any mouse or rat would do. Eventually, it would bump into the lever. The lever would dispense a food pellet. This would be rewarding to the rat, and the rat would again try to figure out what it had done to get the food pellet reward. Eventually, over trial and error, the rat would find that when it pressed down on the lever, it would get a food reward. And this behavior would continue to increase. There would be less searching, less crawling up the walls, and an immediate response of going to pull the lever for food. As we get further into talking about operant conditioning, we'll find out how we can bring a light signal into this and make it a little bit more elaborate. Skinner is known as a radical behaviorist. He has often made statements that everything, even to the extent of love, is just a conditioned response. Here you have him talking about the fact that food is often followed by the response of eating, and that he can actually determine whether the animal will do what he wants them to do without even caring about whether or not the animal is actually experiencing hunger. And he then goes and basically repeats Thorndike's law of effect. Organisms tend to repeat responses that have led to positive outcomes, and they tend not to repeat responses that lead to neutral or negative outcomes. This is the first time we've used the word neutral, but that becomes important. Something that doesn't get a favorable consequence is not guaranteed to increase, and in fact, Skinner often felt that without any favorable consequence, the neutral would lead to a decrease in the behavior as well. So again, he felt that everything that we do was essentially a process of conditioning. We're going to begin talking about the definitions between reinforcement and later punishment. It's really important as we talk about what reinforcement is that you understand that any behavior that increases due to the consequence provided is reinforced. We have positive reinforcement, and in this case, positive means the addition of to increase the behavior. We have negative reinforcement, which means the removal of to increase a behavior. The biggest error that students will make is that they will believe that negative reinforcement is another way of saying punishment, and it is not. And here's my quick example to you. Every time you get in your car, if you do not put on your seatbelt, your car will start to make a chiming sound. Very quickly and over time, you have increased the speed at which you put on your seatbelt to avoid the chiming sound. If I ask you, did your seatbelt behavior increase or decrease? The answer is it increased. And I'll ask you why. Well, my behavior increased to avoid the chiming sound. That's a negative reinforcement. The target behavior of putting on my seatbelt has increased so I can avoid the annoying chiming sound that my car makes. In this situation, we have a much easier one, and it's positive reinforcement. The baby accidentally smiles. An element of his environment, his father, responds to the smile, picks him up, shows him love and attention. Baby Terrell continues to smile. In fact, he increases the smiling. Something has been added from his environment, the attention from his father, to increase the smiling. We can take that and we can apply it to this situation, where not only do you see positive reinforcement, but you see what happens when we omit a reinforcement, or we just don't pay attention to the behavior. So, on day one, a child is asking for their doll, and they use 3 different ways of saying it: doll, da, and dat. If, over time, the parents respond only to the word doll, you will find that the word or the word use of doll increases until day 20, da and dat are not utilized at all. If the parents respond not at all to da and dat, eventually those behaviors without any consequence are more likely to die off and not be there anymore. It will feel like I'm harping on this, but it is really, really important. A reinforcer is anything that strengthens or increases the behavior it follows. A positive reinforcement is when a response is followed by, usually we'll call it a reward, but by something positive or desired by the learner. A negative reinforcement is going to be anything that increases a behavior because what was unpleasant can be removed. So, positive reinforcement. You come into class and the teacher reads your essay to everybody, and you like the attention, so you try to improve your essay writing. You want to write another stellar essay so it can be read in class. Negative reinforcement. You've recently broken up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you decide to try a different path to your next class in the hallway so you can avoid them. You successfully avoid them. So the very next day, you use the same path. You have avoided something adversive, so you increase the use of this new pathway. Very much like you avoid the chiming or the annoying sound of your car and you increase your seatbelt use. Negative reinforcement is when the target behavior increases by avoiding or having something undesirable removed. Positive reinforcement is when the target behavior increases because something pleasant or what we'd consider rewarding is provided in the situation. In either case, reinforcement means increase of target behavior. Okay, so let's practice with these two different ideas of reinforcement and punishment. We're going to look at the same response but with different consequences. Here you have Susie, and Susie loves attention in class. She writes a phenomenal essay, and as her teacher, I share it with the entire class, and in fact, I ask her to come up and speak in front of the class. She finds this incredibly rewarding, can't wait to go home and tell her parents about it. The next time we write an essay, she uses every literary device she can think of to make it the most amazing essay ever, so possibly have more time in front of the class again. But then we have another situation, and here's Timmy. Timmy hates being in front of the class. He writes an amazing essay, and being his teacher, wanting him to share it with everybody and feel the praise that he gets from his peers, I make him stand in front of the class and read it to everyone. He hates this. He doesn't like the attention, so what is probably going to be the response in his behavior to this consequence? Well, chances are Timmy's not going to fail the class or stop writing essays, but he's probably going to make sure that he writes an essay bad enough that he doesn't get asked to speak in front of the class again. So when we look at the two situations, what is reinforcing to one person could actually be punishing to another, which is why it's very important to understand that with operant conditioning, the learner is the one that you have to tailor everything to. Situation number 2. Here we have Bethany and Tracy sitting in class, and they're talking to each other. Now, if they normally love being in class and are really, really well behaved, and I come over and I yell at them for talking, and in fact I kick them out, they may actually decrease their talking behavior in class. If, however, they hate being in class and they love talking, and I come over and I kick them out, and they enjoy getting kicked out of the classroom and increase their talking behavior, then I've reinforced them. Again, as the teacher, it's not up to me, it's up to them. So the reinforcement is getting kicked out. If they don't want to be there, and the consequence is I kick them out, then they're going to increase the undesirable behavior that allows them to get kicked out. However, the flip side is, if they like being in class and they don't like getting sent to the office, that consequence may actually shut them down and prevent them from talking altogether. So the target behavior of being in class and being good participants will increase and decrease based off of essentially the consequence that is provided. This is a nice kind of quick way of looking at positive versus negative reinforcement. Now here again, we're talking about reinforcement. If you notice, the effect on the behavior is the same for both. It's an increase in the behavior because both of these are reinforcements. So positive reinforcement, the consequence has to be the addition of something. Negative reinforcement, it has to be the avoidance of something. So here we have someone who is studying to make the dean's list. They study, the consequence is they make the dean's list. The effect on their behavior is that it should increase their studying in the future because they want the same consequence. For negative reinforcement, they want to avoid losing their academic scholarship, so they increase their studying. The consequence, they avoid the loss of the academic scholarship, so they increase their studying in the future. Again, if you look at the consequence, one is the addition of making the dean's list, it's rewarding. The second one is the avoidance of, avoiding the loss of their academic scholarship. Both of those cause the exact same increased behavior. So whether it is positive or negative, those don't mean good or bad. They mean the addition of or the reward of versus the removal of or the avoidance of. The next two topics we'll talk about are escape learning versus avoidance learning. And the way that I try to get students to understand this is that you have to actually experience something to know to escape it, but to avoid it, you just have to know it's coming. It will make sense in a moment. So what you see below you is another variant of a Skinner box, but it's called a shuttle box. This box, set up much like a Skinner box, has a wall partition in the middle where the animal can move between the two compartments. In escape learning, the animal is going to be negatively reinforced. In other words, it's going to increase the behavior to avoid something adversive. So the floor of the cage is slightly electrified. The researchers can run a shock through the gridded floor, causing a discomfort to the animal. The animal is on the left side of the shuttle box, the floor is electrocuted, and the animal will search and scramble trying to find a way out. When it finds the small partition, the open door, window type thing, it's going to jump across the partition into the area that's not electrified. The researcher will put the animal back into the other side, and once the floor becomes electrified again, the animal is going to more quickly locate the small opening to escape into the next compartment. Negative reinforcement actually plays a key role in this. The animal learns to avoid something adversive by escaping into a safe location. Avoidance learning, however, is a little bit different. In this one, we kind of bring in an element of classical conditioning with the operant conditioning. So in this case, there's going to be a signal, and in operant conditioning, there are no signal stimuli like you would have in classical conditioning, like the sound of the bell signals the onset of food. That's classical conditioning. Here we have the behavior is receiving a consequence, good or bad, the behavior increases or decreases. With avoidance learning, the animal in the shuttle box will actually have a signal stimuli. So put the dog mentally back in the left-hand side of the shuttle box. Before the floor is electrocuted, a tone or a light will go off. Then the floor gets electrocuted, the animal tries to find its way out, goes through the partition, and is on the safe side. Put them back in the previous situation on the left-hand side of the box. A light or a tone is played, and the animal searches for that opening, and the shock then comes and the animal escapes. Eventually, the animal will make a very strong association between the light or the sound being played and the onset of the shock, so that they can avoid the shock entirely, hear the sound or see the light, and immediately flee into the next compartment. So the question becomes, where is the relevance in all of this for humans? Well, avoidance learning might explain why children may hear a door or a garage or something of an abusive parent, hear that door open or shut as they come home, and that child run to a safe place and hide. They've learned that that signals the onset of the consequence, the abusive parent, and then they are able to avoid them by going somewhere and hiding from them. I know it's not a really happy way of looking at it, but avoidance learning and escape learning don't really have a lot of really happy applications. So in this case, the warning light is the conditioned stimulus eliciting or evoking the fear conditioned response. The escape to the other side is the operant conditioning. The nice thing about operant conditioning, which is not present in classical conditioning, is the ability to make really complex behaviors. If you've ever been to Busch Gardens or any place where they do animal training, you're going to find out that most of those behaviors were shaped. They can get wolves to jump on tree stumps and do complex kind of routines all within the wolf's capability. And the question is, how do they get them to run through these shows perfectly? And they will tell you that they shape the behavior through positive reinforcement. In other words, they get the animal to slowly move towards the desired response, what we'll call successive approximations, and they reward them incrementally as they get there. Shaping happens in all sorts of different activities, from sports to potty training, as you see here on this slide, to animal training. So with shaping, you're not getting the perfect behavior and giving the reward. You're getting a close enough or maybe even a desired behavior and then getting the reward. A question that you guys will find on your test is, how would you shape a cat's behavior to pull a wagon or something like that? And the idea is that cats don't naturally pick up and tug on things. That's more of a dog behavior. But you would first reward the cat for coming along and batting at a rope. Reward the cat until that behavior becomes consistent. Then you would reward the cat's behavior when it started to bite on the rope. Once that becomes consistent, you would move on to the cat pulling on the rope and actually moving the wagon or whatever it is that you wanted the cat to move. And eventually the full behavior would emerge, and that would get rewarded as well. It's really easy when you move into something like potty training. So most parents who are potty training don't just get a child that walks in and says it's time for me to use the toilet, and the child goes and sits on the toilet. What they get is a child that is developmentally ready to use a toilet, but might need help shaping the behavior. So here's a sticker chart, and that's often why sticker charts are used to help reward the child as they incrementally build up the ability to be potty trained. And it's going to start with something very simple like being able to take down your trainers and sit on the potty. And those two behaviors, you're going to start giving them stickers. And then eventually you're going to start giving them stickers for actually going in the potty. And then you're going to give them stickers for flushing when they're done. And eventually you're going to give them stickers for being able to take off their trainer pants, sit on the potty, go potty, flush the potty, and then wash their hands, the full and complete behavior. We can shape a multitude of behaviors by slowly and incrementally reinforcing the desired behaviors towards the end goal. Chaining is another complex way that we can shape a behavior. So when we chain behaviors, there are certain behaviors like swimming or even riding a bike that require different behaviors that happen simultaneously. So swimming's a really good one. With swimming, you have to learn to pull with your arms, you have to learn how to kick your feet, and you also have to learn how to float. If you've ever taken swim classes, or as a parent I've taken my kids to swim class, they often train these behaviors separately. They'll do something like hold onto the wall and kick your feet as you let your body float away. And then they may train on a kickboard or something, but they get the kids to kick their legs properly. And then the pulling behavior with the arms. They may have them stand in the pool and just actually kind of do the arm strokes. And then maybe have them kind of be part of a kickboard and do the arm strokes. And then they're going to separately have them learn how to float on their tummy and their back. Ultimately, once each of those individual behaviors has been almost mastered and reinforced, they're going to pull it all together like links in a chain and get the total behavior. So they'll have the child take in a deep breath of air, try to float on their tummy, pull with their arms and kick with their legs, and get the full complex behavior. Normally in class at this point, I would do a shaping experiment with you, and I would prove to you how much more effective reinforcement is than punishment. While we can't do that, there is something really simple to understand. Very rarely is there more than one desired behavior. But there are usually millions upon millions of options out there that are not desired behaviors. People will work for the desired behavior, one, if they understand what it is, and two, if there's a good reinforcement for it. Not necessarily a reward, but they understand that it's the desired behavior. Punishment doesn't necessarily work because it doesn't tell you what the desired behavior is. It just tells you what you did wrong. And you might decrease a desired behavior due to the punishment. Okay, so we are on to the last couple of ideas for today. There are two different types of reinforcers, a primary reinforcer versus a secondary reinforcer. While it doesn't look like it's the most important term on this, you want to know what a token reinforcer is because it's on your midterm and because you need to know it. So primary reinforcers are going to be anything that you will find biologically reinforcing. And we say innately, meaning that it's tied into your survival. Food, water, warmth, those will be things that are going to reinforce you primarily. So I could put a $5 bill in front of my dog and tell him to sit, and it's not going to make my dog sit. But all I have to do is put a little treat in front of my dog and tell him to sit, and he's going to sit. So innately or biologically reinforcing tends to work throughout the entire animal kingdom. Secondary reinforcers have to be learned. That could be praise, that could be applause, that could be money. They have to be associated with a primary reinforcer for us to understand that they're desirable. So money is a really good example. Little kids could care less about a $20 bill if you offer them an Oreo cookie. But you're much older and you understand that you can buy a lot of Oreo cookies with your $20 bill. So when we look at secondary reinforcers, we see them as desirable, but it's only because they have been associated often with a primary reinforcer. Now, I told you guys before that you don't see secondary reinforcers in the animal kingdom, and that's still very true. However, You can take higher order animals like chimpanzees and train them to understand how secondary reinforcers work. In other words, you can get them to associate a token with food, and then they will start to do behaviors that allow them to earn tokens because they can then change those tokens in for food. So the secondary reinforcer is attached strongly to the primary reinforcer, and the animal or the person will work for that secondary reinforcer, knowing that they can get a primary reinforcer in exchange. Again, it's really important to understand the distinction between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. They're both as types of associative learning. In classical conditioning, we take a stimulus that you already understand, which we call the unconditioned stimulus. It causes, or it is a reflex. It causes the unconditioned response. You bring in something neutral that becomes conditioned, your conditioned stimulus, and now that causes the same response. In other words, food causes salivation, bell plus food equals salivation. Now the bell causes the salivation. In operant conditioning, it has everything to do with consequence. So, I want my dog to sit. I give my dog a treat and I use the command sit. The dog gets the treat. Eventually, over time, the dog will associate sitting, that behavior, with the positive consequence of getting a food treat. It is consequence driven. If there is no consequence, there is no conditioning. At this point, make sure that you have completed your worksheet. Go back and review any of the terms or concepts that you need to understand for this section. Then go on and attempt the worksheet that has to do with the different types of reinforcement behaviors.